Good evening. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. As part of our lecture series, we are very privileged to have with us tonight Jennet Conant. For over a decade, Jennet Conant's book, 109 East Palace, has been the #1 bestseller in the Los Alamos History Museum. It is, of course, the story of Dorothy McKibben and Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project here in Los Alamos. Jennet is also the author of Tuxedo Park, The Irregulars, and A Covert Affair, all books about World War II and all New York Times bestsellers. So we're expecting a lot out of this one too. Jennet is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. She is, of course, the granddaughter of James Bryant Conant, the president of Harvard University during World War II, and one of the leaders during the Manhattan Project. Her new book is a biography of James B. Conant. Great read, as all of her books are. And so, since you want to hear from her instead of me, without further ado, Jennet Conant.
I want to begin by thanking the Los Alamos Historical Society for having me here today and express my gratitude to them for the important work that they're doing. I can't tell you how strange it is for me to be here because this building, this place, it was something I heard about my whole childhood, and it still, even though I've been here many times, has a sort of mythical quality for me. Growing up, obviously I heard about this place all the time. And my friend and neighbor for many years in New York City was Nora Ephron. And she used to joke to me all the time, if you can survive your family, you have material for life. And of course, she proved her point because she made countless movies and wrote many books and essays about her crazy Hollywood family. And she was probably paraphrasing another very famous writer, Graham Greene, who said that childhood is the bank balance of every writer. And they were very different people, but I think that they both agreed that those early years were the crucible, and it didn't matter what you did later in life, but it was that early time that formed the writer's point of view and enduring interests. And it was really certainly been the case for me. Almost all my books have been directly inspired by the stories I heard growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Harvard and MIT's backyard, surrounded by scientists and bomb builders, by my grandfather and his Manhattan Project alumni. They were wonderful men. They were obviously incredibly smart. They were funny. They were some of the best storytellers you can imagine. And together they had made some of the deadliest weapons in the world. My book, 109 East Palace, as you all know, was inspired by the colorful tales I heard of the pioneer days of Los Alamos. Almost every Christmas, when my grandfather and his friends would come over to the house, they would tell stories about the impassable roads, the horrendous housing, and the hilarious stunts they pulled to keep themselves amused and to annoy the army. George Kiszczakowski, who was a brilliant chemist, he was on the Harvard faculty, a very close friend of my grandfather's and sort of an honorary uncle in our house, and he built the detonator for the bomb. He loved to reminisce about the Los Alamos days, and his favorite stories always were about riding horseback with Oppenheimer, and they loved to tell about how they would take these arrogant, young, know-it-all East Coast physicists and take them out for a gallop until they begged for mercy and agreed to do anything they asked. I always came away with the impression, I think, growing up, that this had been, for my grandfather and his fellow scientists, the adventure of a lifetime and the achievement of a lifetime. Just lost.
Microphone is gone.
Hello?
Just do a switch.
Uh-oh.
Why do you do batteries in there?
Is there a switch? No switch. There's another microphone. There is Can you hear me now? Yes. No?
Please speak into the microphone.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello?
There.
Very close?
Very soon it'll be 8.
I know, really. So I heard these stories growing up, but by the time I was a teenager, the Vietnam War dominated the news, and those kinds of heroic stories were out of vogue. I thought they sounded too good to be true, more like fiction than fact, something exaggerated by too many retellings and too much Christmas punch. But many years later, when I became a journalist and a magazine writer, those old war stories used to come back to me. They would invade my dreams and kind of haunt me and insist on being written down. And I found eventually that I would feel compelled to try and recall those stories, to try and see beyond the shadowy figures and the fragments of memory to the facts. I needed to discover why those stories, this wartime history, was so important to my family and our country, and they are so intertwined, and they seemed important to understanding both the past and our present predicament and the very precarious state of our world. To be clear, my new book is the story of a man in his times. It is a biography, not a memoir. These are not events remembered by me. Most of the events I chronicle took place long before I was born. But I do have a very personal connection to the subject and to the idea of what lengths a democracy should go to defend itself and its cherished principles of freedom, because of everything that my grandfather James B. Conant did and failed to do in forging the nuclear age that we now live in. As a key advisor to 3 presidents, from Franklin Roosevelt to Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was at the center of some of the greatest challenges and crises of the 20th century. He was a brilliant scientist, a chemist. He was a bold pioneer of nuclear weapons, a vigilant Cold Warrior, and a passionate reformer of public education for nearly 50 years. He was what was once called the wise men, advisors to presidents, a term we rarely employ to describe those in Washington these days. And he helped guide our country through those perilous years and helped our nation assert its place in world affairs. Twice, he was asked by his country to design and manufacture what we now call weapons of mass destruction. During World War I, it was poison gas. In World War II, the atomic bomb. Each time, bound by the fear that these new advances in weapons technology would allow the Germans to triumph, he did as he was asked, even though he was raised by a Quaker mother and was really fundamentally averse to war. Each time, convinced that the democracies of Western Europe were under threat and that these new weapons might hasten the end of fighting and save lives, he dedicated himself to what he called the hideous business of beating the devil at his own game. He felt he had no choice but to serve his country the best way he knew how, in its hour of need. He saw himself first and foremost as a defender of democracy and continued to commit his country to fighting to protect the fledgling democracies abroad in 3 wars, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. At the same time, however, he fought to protect freedoms at home. He fought for an open and fluid society, for a fairer system of higher education, for free discussion, a healthy clash of ideas, a competitive spirit, and a courageous and responsible citizenry. As president of Harvard for 20 years, he was an outspoken social critic, committed to intelligent and informed leadership at the highest levels of government, Democratic or Republican. And he was committed to creating a better educated and responsible public capable of making the difficult decisions that he knew lay ahead. To that end, he helped create the SAT, and he implemented it in schools across the country, convinced that equal opportunity and upward mobility were essential if our country was continued to remain strong. As a social inventor, his term for the half-century spent in public service, he kept trying to find new formulas to keep alive what he called the precarious American political experiment known as democracy. The historian McGeorge Bundy, himself a former national security advisor to Kennedy and Johnson, wrote that there was probably no American of his generation, the proverbial greatest generation, who made a larger mark in more different areas of American national life than James B. Conant. As a war scientist, however, my grandfather felt he had much to answer for. The atomic bomb's, quote, potentialities for destruction, he wrote, were so terrible as to outweigh any possible gains that one might one day accrue from this new form of power. He acknowledged that the nuclear weapons that he had helped usher into existence had added to the frightful insecurity of the world, and he did not think that future generations would be inclined to thank him for it. All of his post-war efforts to control nuclear weapons, to prevent the development of the hydrogen bomb, fusion weapons of unlimited yield, and to halt or at least moderate the vicious arms race had come to nothing. My grandfather was painfully aware of the irony that America in the nuclear age was overwhelmingly more vulnerable than had been before. Now, with North Korea moving relentlessly toward nuclear conflict, threatening to deliver its deadly weapons to South Korea, Japan, Guam, and the Pacific coast of the United States, the all-out nuclear conflict that my grandfather dreaded seems close at hand. How then to judge a man who dedicated his career to safeguarding democracy and the American way of life, yet feared that the nuclear force he helped unleash in the summer of 1945 was so dangerous it could ultimately lead to Armageddon and the extinction of all mankind? People often ask me how I can be objective enough about my grandfather to write this book. The answer is there is no possibility of being objective. Not about my grandfather, and not about such a contested and controversial subject as the atomic bomb and its consequences. I have an obvious bias. But I would wonder who is impartial about world wars, about the creation of weapons of mass destruction, the death of millions, the tragedy of lost sons and desecrated cities, all weighed against the terror of totalitarianism, the Nazis' murderous regime, and the horrors of genocide. It's almost beyond our scope as human beings to make sense of such cataclysmic events, but we must try. The search for answers and for understanding, and perhaps a modicum of hard-won wisdom, is also part of the human condition and certainly part of our better natures. So the historian in me is compelled to ask the hard questions and assess the evidence. My task in writing this book was to sift through a mound of documentary evidence with a disciplined and dispassionate eye, to sort through the hundreds, make that thousands, of letters, diaries, scientific reports, memorandums, and memoirs, congressional records, and literally acres of military papers. And then there's the testimony, the interviews with the participants, the politicians, the scientists, the policymakers, all biased and fallible and incomplete as their knowledge of the events that were taking place around them. And finally, there are the books that revisit Truman's fateful decision to use the bomb. Revisionist histories, as they're known in the trade. And there's not a 5-foot shelf of them, there's at least a dozen 5-foot shelves of them. And they all tell a slightly different version of the story. In fact, one of the best books has the best title, The Most Controversial Decision by Wilson Misgamble. Even a quick perusal of these books will reveal that my grandfather's career occupies some of the most disputed terrain in our country's history. And it's easy to see why history is such a fractious business and why very good historians often disagree. As the historical novelist Hilary Mantel recently reminded those of us in the nonfiction business, I quote, "Even the driest, most data-driven research involves an element of interpretation. Evidence is always partial, information is not knowledge, and history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It's the record of what's left on the record. It's the plan, the positions taken when we stop the dance to note them down." Now that's a writer. So the paper trail in the archives only points to the truth. The biographer has to go deeper, probe behind the stated policy positions to the unstated agenda and ulterior motives, both political and personal, and explore murky and painful questions of morality and responsibility. It is, I think, the act of asking the questions that help shed light on crucial issues. And so I can only hope that my very intimate and detailed exploration of one war scientist's experience proves enlightening and helps inspire interest and discussion and deeper reflection among my readers. Ultimately, as a historian, reporter, and granddaughter, what drove me to write this book was the desire to understand what it must have been like for my grandfather, who was at all times a private citizen, not an elected official, to make such momentous decisions in such a fraught time, to have the courage and vision to try to deliver victory fast enough to save lives and achieve a lasting peace. It was a desire to walk in his shoes and understand the agonizing uncertainty surrounding those decisions, the human ordeal. And it was an ordeal. I wanted to paint a portrait of history as lived in the minute, to place his life in the context of the tumultuous moment when he became one of Roosevelt's scientific generals, charged with mobilizing in men and technology for the nation's defense, and made responsible for all the decisions relating to this awesome new form of power, nuclear weapons. So this book was, in a sense, a search for his legacy. And as the only nation to have ever used a nuclear bomb, it's a search for America's legacy as well. My grandfather wrote in his memoir that if he had been born in another era, he would have been happy to remain in the laboratory and enjoy a quiet life as an academic chemist. I hate to quibble with him, but I think that's a bit disingenuous. He was much too ambitious for that. But in any case, that was not to be his fate. He came of age in a turbulent time, at a time when science and technology were coming of age and rewriting the rules of war. When the Germans unleashed poison gas in 1915, it was a turning point in the history of military technology. The toxic new chemical gases pioneered by the Germans were the very first weapon of mass destruction. They were designed to drive the enemy from the dugouts and break through the lines in what had become a bloody war of attrition. And by the time America entered World War I in the spring of 1917, both sides were deploying chlorine and phosgene gas, ushering in a new acute phase of the chemical war. The summer that Americans arrived in France, the Germans launched an overwhelming assault using an even worse toxin, mustard gas. The United States was forced to scramble to catch up to the new technology and tactics of chemical weapons. James P. Conant was a newly minted 24-year-old Harvard chemist on his way to enlist at the Washington, D.C. headquarters when he was stopped on the sidewalk by one of his professors, a chemist named James Norris, who told him that with his brains, he could do a hell of a lot more for his country by helping to make these new weapons than just by shouldering a gun. Conant spent the next 2 years in uniform designing and manufacturing poison gas for the military, first perfecting a new method for making mustard gas in Washington, D.C. in the laboratories of American University, which had been requisitioned by the war. By August 1918, a huge poison gas factory had been built at the Aberdeen Proving Ground on the Chesapeake, and it was churning out 30 tons of liquid mustard a day and shipping it to the front. Conant was quickly promoted to captain, then major, and then transferred to a top secret military facility hidden in an old abandoned automobile plant in Willoughby, Ohio, about 20 miles east of Cleveland. His classified assignment was to produce an even more powerful poison gas to combat the advanced nerve agents being made by the Germans. The U.S. was in a race for technical superiority, and the Germans were ahead. He and another chemist, Winford Lee Lewis from Northwestern University, succeeded in creating the deadliest gas ever made, a lethal arsenic compound designated G34, and later known as lewisite. Lewisite was deadly in even very small concentrations. A third of a teaspoon applied to the skin could kill a man. But its chief advantage was that the effects were immediate, unlike delayed effects of mustard, which meant that advancing forces could move immediately into enemy territory without fear of choking on their own fumes. It was the breakthrough the War Department had been waiting for. The head of the Chemical Warfare Service was convinced a surprise assault using lewisite, America's super poison gas, would deliver a crushing blow to the Germans and finally bring the very long war to an end. Conant worked around the clock 7 days a week in the top secret military compound known to the men as the mousetrap, because once you went in, you never came out. The strictest security measures were enforced. It was encircled by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards day and night. They worked at a frantic pace. The manufacturing process was incredibly dangerous. The risk of an explosion or a deadly leak of toxic fumes was ever present. My grandfather, who had lost one of his best friends to a laboratory explosion only a few years earlier, was constantly haunted by fears that the whole place would go up in flames. He went to great lengths to ensure the security of his crew. Although many men died in wartime gas factories, there were no deaths on Conant's watch. In only 4 months, overseeing every stage of the development, he and his team of chemists succeeded in producing enough lewisite to send to the battlefield for the spring offensive. But before it could be deployed, the Germans surrendered on November 11, 1918. The steel drums of liquid lewisite were dumped at sea, a common practice in those days to get rid of chemical waste. Conant was relieved that in a war of awful weapons, the worst would not be used. He had no idea that the Willoughby secret factory would become a dress rehearsal for the next war. The day after the armistice, his face was on the front page of newspapers across the country. Headlines in the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the New York Times celebrated the chemist's unbelievable accomplishment in producing the most powerful weapon ever made, helping to finally end the war, to end all wars. World War I became known as the Chemist's War, and it made stars of the men who had helped secure victory. And they were poised to play an even bigger role in decades to come, in everything from weaponry to industry to the burgeoning new pharmaceutical industry. Chemists were in demand. Conant was inundated with job offers, but when Harvard offered him a junior professorship, he went home where he had a girl waiting. Her father just happened to be Theodore William Richards, chairman of the Harvard Chemistry Department, so it was a pretty good marriage. He was America's first Nobel Prize winner. In her diary, she records her modest suitor's 3 goals for his life. 1, to be the greatest organic chemist in America. 2, to become president of Harvard. 3, to be a key public service, maybe in accounting. By the time he was 40, he had achieved the first 2. 1933 was quite a year for Germany, America, and me, he wrote. Hitler rose to power, Franklin Roosevelt took office, and I became president of Harvard. But as the Third Reich's modern, well-equipped armies began their march across national borders and Europe's democracies fell to fascist guns, it became clear to my grandfather that another terrible world war was not far off. Even by the late 1930s, however, the vast majority of Americans and their leaders in Congress wanted to ignore the outbreak of hostilities abroad. They called it the European conflict to make it clear that it wasn't the U.S.'s problem. But Conant was one of those stubborn souls who resist such complacency. He was a man of principle and a born dissenter, as he put it, descended from the original American dissenters, the Pilgrims. He demanded that attention be paid to the impending disaster, no matter how unpopular his speeches were, and he became one of the first and most outspoken interventionists, pushing the U.S. to start preparing its defenses for the global war he felt sure was inevitable. Now, he was more alarmed than most American leaders in Congress because of his knowledge of a fateful coincidence in nuclear physics. By 1939, it had become certain that an unprecedented release of energy accompanied the splitting of the uranium atom. Scientists familiar with the phenomenon immediately grasped the importance of this finding, and that this nuclear reaction was far greater than any ever seen before. The famous Danish physicist Niels Bohr carried the startling news to the United States. What the scientists realized was that this division process, known as fission, would likely result in a geometrically growing chain of reactions. The large-scale release of energy by the fission of uranium would be 1,000,000-fold greater, pound for pound, than any existing explosive. To the Hungarian refugee physicist Leo Szilard, the relevance of this breakthrough to the looming war in Europe was inescapable. He understood in theory that a bomb of terrifying force could be created if the technical obstacles could be overcome. He persuaded his good friend Albert Einstein into writing the now famous letter to Roosevelt, warning that, quote, extremely powerful bombs of a new type could now be built, and urging him to pursue the development of an atomic bomb in the United States. In June 1940, Roosevelt responded to the scientists' pleas for action by approving a new federal agency, the National Defense Research Committee, the NDRC. Conant would join forces with Vannevar Bush, the former vice president of MIT, and together they would begin the massive mobilization of men and technology that was probably in itself the greatest single innovation of the war and the main reason for America's eventual triumph. With one ambitious goal in mind, defeating Germany, Bush and Conant planned and coordinated a huge new wartime organization. The scientific research started to be advanced on an unprecedented scale. My grandfather classified all fission research, formed committees to study the possibility of a uranium bomb, and acquired funding for experiments. But at the same time that he was doing this, he was using Harvard as a bully pulpit, and he gave one speech after another urging rearmament. With the Battle of Britain in full swing and the German Luftwaffe laying siege to England's cities, Conant carried the interventionist torch for Roosevelt, who was running for re-election and afraid of alienating voters. In the worst winter of the Blitz, Roosevelt dispatched Conant on an urgent mission to England to iron out the details of the secret scientific exchange that would lead to a nuclear alliance and the two countries becoming partners in the effort to build the first atomic bomb. London was being besieged by bombs, and Conant made the trip over his colleagues' objections that it was too hazardous an assignment, and the war effort could not afford to lose him. He insisted on going and argued in a letter that the odds were probably not more than 1 in 1,000 of my being permanently put out of commission. And after asking the country's young men to enlist, and so many in Harvard to enlist, he felt duty-bound to take some risks himself. He spent 6 weeks in London. He met with all the highest military officials, toured their secret radar installations, which were at the time the most advanced in the world, and made all kinds of arrangements for exchanges of secret scientific and military technology. He had an audience with the king and met frequently with Churchill, who he admired and even liked, even though he said he had a tendency to bellow lines from his famous speeches. But the last time he met with the British Prime Minister in the bomb-proof basement of 10 Downing Street, Churchill was in a somber mood. He informed him of the impending debacle in Greece. Rommel's armored divisions were beating back British troops. They were exhausted and under-equipped, and the Nazis would soon reach the Suez Canal. The British troops there were doomed, Churchill told him. Here we are standing alone. What is going to happen? My grandfather's experience of the Blitz and Churchill's gloomy frame of mind so terrified him that he rushed back to the United States and reported to Roosevelt that England was on the brink of defeat. He urged the president to redouble his efforts to move America in the direction of war. And he continued to make his impassioned speeches begging America to come to Europe's defense. Even as he was stepping up his high-profile political activities, he was taking on a more daunting assignment in his secret defense work. With the country inching towards war, Roosevelt vastly expanded the wartime agency and turned it into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, known to you all as the OSRD. And Conant would become head of all of the uranium research and make recommendations on this experimental new bomb. Bush and Conant, together, proved to be an exceptional team. They were both flinty New Englanders, and they forged a close bond. And their mutual respect was such that Bush would say later that he could not remember a serious disagreement they had in 5 tense and tumultuous years. Secretary of War Henry Stimson would later observe that the two won the confidence of President Roosevelt at the beginning of the national emergency and set a standard of effort which in its combination of soundness and daring left open no intelligent course but full and hearty cooperation. One of my favorite stories is told by Arthur Compton, the brilliant University of Chicago physicist. And he always tells the story that on a cool evening in September 1941, he and Ernest Lawrence pretty much trapped my grandfather by the fireplace in his home and tried to convince him that they had to immediately start a crash course to try and build a bomb. For months, my grandfather had been dragging his feet. He was the one who was going to have to make the decision as head of the top secret S1 section of where this money would go. And it was a very tough decision. He did not want to waste precious dollars and resources on a weapon that would not be ready in time to win the war. Too much was stake, and too many top scientists and too many military leaders still thought that the bomb was a boondoggle. Compton Lawrence begged him to start the program. They were convinced, they said, that they thought the bomb was a viable weapon. They got more and more excited, more and more worked up, and they kept beseeching him, arguing with him. We just cannot afford to let the Nazis beat us, Compton agreed. It would be a disaster. Finally, my grandfather relented and told them that he had long considered them to be correct. He had come to the same conclusion weeks earlier. So he looked at Ernest Lawrence and he said, "You're so enthusiastic about this crash project, Lawrence. You're convinced of the importance of these fission bombs. Are you ready to devote the next several years of your life to getting them made?" Compton said later that he could see the stunned surprise on Lawrence's face. Lawrence was one of the most ambitious physicists in America. He has a huge cyclotron project underway. This would mean stepping back from all of his work, his life's ambition, and going full-time into the weapons business. Compton said he hesitated only for a second. "If you tell me it's my job," Lawrence said, "I'll do it." On December 6, 1941, based on Conant and Bush's recommendation, Roosevelt approved an all-out American effort to develop a fission bomb. They were to have all the resources the nation could make available. The following morning, December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, wiping out the better part of America's Pacific Fleet. 3 days later, Germany declared war on the United States, and America now faced a war on 2 fronts. They did not yet have a modern army that could vanquish the Germans in Europe, and they had vastly underestimated the strength of the Japanese. It was going to be a long and grueling struggle. Conant knew they had no choice but to overwhelm the enemy's advantage with innovation. But 6 months of research, and they arrived at the very important May 1942 deadline to decide how much money to commit to this experimental new weapon. And they still had 5 different methods of producing fissionable material that seemed promising. It was still too early to know which of these methods was the best: the centrifuge, diffusion, electromagnetic methods of separating uranium-235, or the uranium graphite pile and heavy water pile methods of producing plutonium. Conant was afraid that if they scratched one method, it would turn out to be the one that was the best. He favored taking a colossal gamble, and in one of the pivotal moments of the project, recommended betting heavily on all 5. FDR trusted Conant's advice, and in June 1942 signed off on an estimated $80 million program. The Manhattan Engineering District was organized. Jeremy Groves was appointed head of what was to become a military project. But by the end of 1942, Groves informed Conant that the project was already exceeding $500 million, and the actual development of the bomb had not even started. In light of the German threat, Conant stood firm and insisted they had to proceed on all 5 methods. Nothing short of an all-out attempt, he told them, would be worthwhile. Groves was so struck by the boldness of this strategy, he later remarked that Conant had the gambling spirit of New England pioneers, a calculated gambling spirit. But it would be a $2 billion bet before they were done. Conant's secret S-1 committee estimated they would have the first bombs by July 1st, 1944. They were over-optimistic by a year. And I will not here retrace the huge ups and downs, crushing disappointments, and delays involved in shepherding 5 experimental methods through at the same time. Enough to say that it was enormously complicated and staggeringly expensive. When General Groves came on board, many of the physicists disliked him and resented him, but my grandfather could see that he was a brilliant expediter and that is what such a vast enterprise desperately needed. The 2 men were polar opposites in many ways, but they worked well together and they became unlikely friends. My grandfather always said that when things went wrong, which was often, the 2 would joke grimly that they should start house hunting in Washington, D.C., because if the bomb fizzled, they would spend the rest of their days testifying before angry congressional committees, trying to tell them what they did with all that money. Groves would later say that he admired Conant's steely reserve and calm reason in times of crisis, especially when he learned that he had 2 young sons in the Pacific Theater in harm's way. They both agreed that the Berkeley physicist Robert Oppenheimer should lead the Los Alamos laboratory. In the beginning, they were almost alone in that opinion. Almost all the senior project scientists objected. They wanted a respected Nobel laureate on the order of Ernest Lawrence, Arthur Compton, I. Rabi. But those men were already indispensable in the jobs they were in. But the problem was Oppenheimer was a theoretician, and Los Alamos was going to be, above all else, an experimental lab. What's more, he had no organizational experience, no leadership experience. He was known to be eccentric, arrogant, and somewhat unworldly, and had supported so many leftist and communist causes, nobody thought he'd ever get any kind of security clearance. But Conant and Groves did not think that his youthful political indiscretions should disqualify him. They believed in him, stuck by him, backed him, and he turned out to be an inspired choice. Oppenheimer and my grandfather became very close. It became an almost father-son relationship. Oppie addressed him as Uncle Jim. He made a lot of mistakes in the beginning. He was new to leadership, and he offended a lot of people. And my grandfather had to pick up the pieces, clean up his messes, make apologies, write letters, smooth over ruffled feathers. But he kept trying to tutor Oppenheimer in the skills of statesmanship, turn him overnight into a leader, support him, and help keep the work at Los Alamos on track. By the end of the war, they were quite devoted to each other. All their efforts culminated in the Trinity test, the explosion of the first plutonium implosion bomb in the Alamogordo Desert in the pre-dawn hours. July 16, 1945. Conant watched the explosion from a shallow trench, only 17,000 yards from point zero. And his description captures the terrifying, awe-inspiring experience. And for this, I need my glasses. A burst of white light that seemed to fill the sky and last for seconds. I had expected a relatively quick and bright flash, but the enormity of the light and its length quite stunned me. My instantaneous reaction was that something had gone wrong and that the thermonuclear transformation of the atmosphere, once discussed as a possibility and only jokingly referred to a few minutes earlier, had actually occurred. It felt, he wrote, like the end of the world. It was the moment that he had hoped for and dreaded. Almost a year earlier, in September 1944, he and Bush wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, expressing their grave concerns about the alarming situation that would result if there was no U.S. policy developed before the weapon was used in combat. They emphasized that progress in the new field of nuclear weapons would be so rapid in some countries that it would, quote, be extremely dangerous for this government to assume that by holding secret its present knowledge, we should be secure. At some point in the near future, they argued, every major population center would lie at the mercy of whichever nuclear nation struck first. To head off this terrifying possibility, they advocated sharing the new scientific information and reaching an international agreement on the future control of nuclear weapons. They warned that if the United States was the first to unleash this indiscriminate destruction on the world, it could precipitate an arms race, and then they would never be safe again. But Conant's and Bush's warnings, echoed by many of the Manhattan Project scientists, were ignored. 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, and a dangerous precedent was set. As appalled as he was by the loss of life, my grandfather never publicly questioned the correctness of Truman's decision to use the bomb to bring the war to a quick and decisive end. He always believed that the bomb's deadly, efficient effect forced the Japanese to surrender to the Allies' superior power. He felt that the shock of the awful weapon was necessary to make the intransigent Japanese military, honor-bound to fight to the last man, understand the futility of continuing the struggle. Ultimately, the bombs allowed the peace faction within the Japanese government to save face and negotiate an end to the war. The debate over the use of the bomb is complicated and endless, and I go into it in some depth in the book. But in the end, war is a grim numbers game, and the painful reality that is in a war of over 50 million dead, the 140,000 lives lost in Hiroshima pale in significance, and that is a horrible, horrible truth. It also has to be remembered that while my grandfather and the members of the interim committee, a panel of scientific and military experts appointed to advise Truman, while they were deliberating, a series of very bloody and grinding battles had marked the spring of 1945. The body bags from the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa totaled almost 20,000, with another 50,000 Americans wounded and more than 90,000 Japanese killed. The number of civilians, men, women, and children caught in the crossfire on these 2 remote, sparsely populated islands exceeded 150,000, though modern estimates put it at much higher than that. By that point in the war, the moral Rubicon had been crossed, and urban centers had long since become a target for aerial bombing. 60 Japanese cities had already been laid to ruin using conventional weapons. Over the course of a single night, on March 9th, the firebombing of Tokyo killed 100,000, injured several times that many, and left over 1 million homeless. But as General Marshall observed grimly of the bombing of the Japanese capital, it seemingly had no effect whatsoever. The Japanese were determined to fight on and promised to punish the invaders in defense of their homeland. To my grandfather, the scientists on the interim committee, and Truman's military advisors, there seemed to be no end in sight. I think the historian Wilson Campbell sums it up best. Those who would rush to judge Truman's decision to use atomic bombs must hesitate a little to appreciate that had he not authorized the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thousands of American and Allied soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen would have been added to the list of those killed in World War II. Added to their number would have been the thousands of Allied prisoners of war who the Japanese promised to execute. Could an American president have survived, politically or personally, knowing that he might have used a weapon that would have avoided such slaughter? But in addition to forcing the Japanese to surrender and averting the need for a land invasion and saving lives on both sides of the conflict, my grandfather had another very pressing reason for wanting the bomb to be used. From the moment he felt the force of the Trinity explosion, he recognized the revolutionary character of nuclear weapons, and that without a means of control, such unprecedented power could overwhelm mankind. From the beginning, his main argument for the combat use of the bomb was the need to prove to the world its devastating strength, so warring nations would realize that the stakes had become too high and nuclear conflict too costly. As he wrote Henry Stimson, dropping the bomb was, quote, the only way to awaken the world to the necessity of abolishing war altogether. No technical demonstration could take the place of actual use with its horrible results. Hard as it may be now for many people to accept, a great many of the wartime scientists, from Niels Bohr to Arthur Compton to Oppenheimer, had come to believe that the atomic bomb might bring an end to war itself. There could be no protection, no effective military countermeasure against such a destructive force. Surely avoiding an arms race and a future nuclear conflict, Conant and Bush insisted, must now be the prime objective of every sane man. But of course, as we know, sanity did not prevail. Weary after years of war, it was probably too much to expect that Roosevelt and Truman after him would be willing to share the so-called winning weapon with our enemies. Strong forces within the U.S. government and military were opposed to sharing the nuclear secret, and in the mistaken belief that America would be able to retain its nuclear monopoly for a long time. From the moment the Russians demonstrated their own bomb in 1949, however, the Cold War began. Discussions of controls of nuclear weapons virtually ceased. My grandfather had a clear-sighted vision of the terrible danger posed by the pell-mell race to develop these deadly weapons. And he foresaw today's dire scenario, a nuclear standoff with the missiles of two opposing nations poised to strike. His ominous warning in the fall of 1945 is as startling now as it was then. There is no defense against a surprise attack with atomic bombs, he wrote. If a situation were to develop where two great powers had stacks of bombs, but neither was sure of the exact status of the other, the possibility of a devastating surprise attack by the one upon the other would poison all our thinking. Like two gunmen with itchy trigger fingers, it would only be a question of who fired first. Under such circumstances, the United States might be the loser. As one of the handful of men who had a hand in creating the nuclear bomb, the decision to use it, who witnessed the first explosion of a nuclear weapon, he probably knew better than anyone that we should never use it again unless we absolutely had to. At the level of policy, he consistently urged caution and restraint. He believed our only hope was that international pressure and tough, patient diplomacy would buy us enough time to change the current nuclear stalemate and a chance to work towards some mutual agreements to control these weapons and moderate the arms race. He led a bitter fight against the development of the hydrogen bomb. And after he lost, he continued to campaign tirelessly for international control of nuclear weapons. When he served as Eisenhower's High Commissioner of Germany from 1953 and 1957, he was on the front lines of the Cold War, and he worked to avoid a devastating nuclear conflict with Russia. He rearmed Germany and helped secure the fledgling democracy's future as part of the NATO alliance. By the time I reached the end of this book and the end of his life, I came to see that it was really about leadership, about a generation that produced men and women with the courage and conviction to lead, and a strong sense of obligation to their country and a desire to give back. As concerned as he was about the external threat, my grandfather was just as concerned about the internal threat, the growing discontent caused by unemployment and the widening economic divide that he believed was imperiling our democracy. In a book called What We Are Fighting to Defend, the first of more than a dozen on the subject, he set down his vision of our distinctive American meritocracy with the promise of social mobility and equality of opportunity for the members of each new generation. He believed the best way to beat our enemies was to lead by example, to show that democracy was better than dictatorship, and that the American form of government furthered the hopes and aspirations of all its citizens. To that end, he dedicated his later years to strengthening our public schools, which he called the engines of democracy. He saw our American form of government as unique and based on one great unifying philosophy: the wide diversity of our beliefs and the tolerance of this diversity. For him, this was the ultimate basis of our democratic creed and the thing that separated us from repressive regimes like Russia and North Korea today. The U.S. was far from perfect in his view, but it was a role model for the world because it always strove to maintain this openness and fairness, these bedrock American ideals. He knew that all the problems he was grappling with, from the atom bomb to national security, to the state of the nation, social mobility, and education, were extremely difficult to solve, and they are still with us 5 decades later. But as difficult as they are, these problems are not necessarily insurmountable. He certainly did not think they were. As one reviewer observed last week, Conant was a man who climbed mountains for fun. He helped defeat the Nazis, widen access to college education, and unleash the power of the atom. He would be the last man to counsel despair. When he died, the New York Times wrote an editorial. To say that he was the last of his breed would be too defeatist a view of America's future. But it is only realistic to acknowledge that a vacancy exists. There is not now any successor in the line that led from Thomas Jefferson to James Bryan Conant. The title of the editorial was The Conant Vacancy. Thank you.
Questions? I love your books. grandfather ever come out to Los Alamos?
Oh, yes, during the
Can you
war.
repeat the questions?
She asked if my grandfather ever came to Los Alamos. Yes, he was essentially Oppenheimer's boss. He was directly responsible for all the recommendations and all the financial allotments given to the Los Alamos Bomb Laboratory. So whenever they had a problem or they needed more money, both those things arose frequently. He traveled from Washington and made the 2-day journey here, sometimes with Groves, sometimes with Bush, often alone. In the early months of the laboratory, he came when they started, and then he came every couple of months. But in the latter stages, particularly after the Thin Man bomb proved impossible, and the schedule was really tightening, and they had enormous expenses. They brought in huge numbers of men to try and complete the work quickly. The budget ballooned out of control, and Oppenheimer was working around the clock and very thin, and people were worried about his health. He started to come every 5 or 6 weeks, really to help solve problems, keep the work going as quickly as possible, and really to support Oppenheimer, cheer him on, and be a sounding board, because there were so many problems and it was a very, very tense time. So he was here very often. He loved it here. He liked to eat at Edith Warner's.
How and where and when did your grandfather pass?
My grandfather retired to Hanover, New Hampshire. He was given a chair at Dartmouth College. He was a very cautious, well-organized man. He lived a quarter of a mile from a hospital and around the corner from his cardiologist. He lived to be 84, and he died in 1978. Any other questions?
How did he manage the presidency at Harvard during the war and had so many other
That's a good question. He frequently wrote in his diary, "I do not see how I can continue to juggle the presidency at Harvard and his war work." He really delegated his responsibility to a sort of an interim president. They didn't call him that. He was a dean. But he basically stepped in and ran the college. My grandfather was in Washington 5 days a week. When he could, he came back to Cambridge on weekends. He was nominally still always president, and he always sort of said, if Harvard had asked him to give up his war work, they knew that his resignation was on the table, so they never did. It's interesting, too, because his rather progressive notions about education and not wanting to preside over a college of rich men's sons and wanting to open it to different religions and different parts of the country scandalized a lot of the conservative Brahmin board members of Harvard. But I think by the time they wanted to fire him, he'd become such an important person in Truman's war effort, in Roosevelt's war effort, that they couldn't, so they were sort of stuck with him, which my grandfather rather enjoyed.
Did you have a close relationship with your grandfather?
I did. In many ways, he was more father than grandfather. Like a lot of great men and a lot of wartime heroes, he was not a good father. He was just not home at all. So his young sons came of age not knowing him. I think it was very difficult to be the son of the president of Harvard. They never felt smart enough. They never felt good enough. And they both ran away to World War II at very young ages. My father at 17 and his older brother, I think it was ROTC, and went straight into the Navy. Unfortunately, they didn't necessarily come back from the war in the best of shape. So my grandfather very much was looked after us and was very much a father figure to me. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming tonight.
behalf of the Board of Directors of the Los Alamos Historical Society for all of the contributions that you have made to our community's history, we would like to give you tonight our Los Alamos History Medal and a little token of our appreciation for all that you have done over the years. Thank you.
Thank you.